Is producing in Hollywood a science or an art? A conversation with the fabulous Lynda Obst ahead on Science Goes to the Movies. Welcome to Science Goes to the Movies, a look at the stories of science and how they change our culture. I'm Faith Saley, and all I can say is Lynda Obst is in the house. Hello, Lynda.
Hi, Faith.
Thank you so much for being here.
I'm thrilled to be here.
We've had a few legendary scientists, but we've never had a legendary movie producer, so thank you. You have produced films like Adventures in Babysitting and Sleepless in Seattle and One Fine Day, and then Contact and Interstellar. So was it on Contact that your inner nerd began to reveal herself? Is that sort of the sea change?
Yes, it was on Contact that my inner geeky nerd person came out, but she was always there, just waiting for an opportunity. Contact took so long to make that only then was it revealed to the rest of the world. But she was always there, being extremely geeky.
Let's talk about how long it took to make. Carl Sagan and his wife, who's one of your dear friends, right?
My best friend,
and
yes.
Druyan,
Yes.
Wrote Contact as a screenplay, right, in 1979?
When Anne and Carl first came to Los Angeles to start working on Cosmos, I was the original Cosmos, Cosmos 1. I was so excited. I spent all my time at their house because I didn't want to go to work. Who would want to go to work when you had Carl and Annie in the neighborhood? And so I went to Carl and I said, do you have any stories, fictional stories about science that you've always wanted to tell? And Carl astonishingly and thrillingly said yes. There's one story I've always had in the back of my mind about first contact, about what would happen when we received through SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, through the very program that he helped set up, First Signal. And he knew the entire story. So the two of us, the three of us, began a process of working on a treatment before the novel was even written. And we had the best time because we're all so close. We were friends for years. In fact, Annie and Carl and I all met on the same night. So we were long best friends by the time we started working on the first treatment. And then when we
you were
had...
just hanging out with Carl Sagan and his wife Anne, a writer, coming up with your best idea for a movie.
Not mine, Carl's.
Yeah, a group of you, yes, Carl's idea. And you're the producer, so you're like midwifing it. It's 1979. Nobody buys it? Because he turned it into a novel in 1985, right?
Well, what happened was I worked for a company called Casablanca, run by a person named Peter Guber. And of course, he owned it because I worked for him.
Okay.
The most fun, I will tell you, by the way, about the early days of writing the treatment was that Carl had to be convinced of the three-act structure of screenplays because Carl doesn't take anything by convention. He needs to be convinced of it, Carl. He needs to be convinced of it by argument and by really cogent argument.
Like a scientist.
Like a scientist. So I had to convince Carl of basically both the three-act structure, Aristotelian story structure, a priori. I had to explain to him and convince him of its logic. He would say, why not 5 acts? Why not 7 acts? And it was the hardest thing that I ever did in my whole career. And I must say it was the best thing I ever did because I really, truly came to understand why there were 3 acts.
Why are there?
Well, because ultimately you need, a movie can't be longer unless it's a limited series, but that's television. A movie ultimately has to have a certain length. And in the first act, the goal of the first act is to introduce all of your themes and characters, your initial characters, and present the thesis. In the second act, you need to complicate that story and then drive all of your themes and characters into tremendous conflict. And so by midpoint, the conflict has been expressed, and by the end of that act, that conflict has reached its ultimate worst expression. And then the job of the last act is to resolve that conflict. And if it keeps going on and on, ultimately there won't be any more shows playing at the cinema that day. That's the sort of shortest way of expressing it. So we had this
and
totally.
Carl Sagan ultimately conceded, right?
He ultimately conceded that if we did anything longer, it would have to be television.
Why was Contact, I mean, that's like development hell. Why did it take so long for it to be made? Because it came out, you started on it, you and Carl and Anne started out in 1979. I think it came out in 1997?
Yeah, it was a horrible process. Basically, my boss, Peter Guber, took it over. I left the company, and Carl and Anne, I think, were a little intimidating to Peter. He thought, Carl's going to make them do real science, and no writer's going to want to do real science. So he didn't stay in contact with Carl, and he hired somebody who used to work for Carl who could bend the science into fake science, and hired a bunch of mediocre screenwriters, in my point of view. And the movie never got made under his auspices. Astonishingly, okay, and this is one of those things that Carl would hate me to call karma, but in a stroke of good fortune, he would prefer me to describe it. My career ended up flourishing after I left Casablanca, and the screenplay returned to me at Warner Brothers after Peter Guber left it. And they said, would you like to develop Contact, Lynda? And I said, I most certainly would. So I was able to mount the movie again as its producer. Bring Carl and Anne back into it was my first move, because we had always intended for the movie to be done accurately as far as science is concerned.
How important is that to you, that the science is accurate?
It is everything to me. And we are the first movie, Contact was the first movie that made accurate science its #1 goal. And
why? Why is that? Why hadn't other movies thought to make science accurate?
Well, for one thing, I have to say that Carl Sagan was its executive producer. And he was the greatest popularizer of science of the 20th century. And there is absolutely no reason for Carl to do a movie if the science is going to be inaccurate. Movies for him were a way of further popularizing science.
Right.
And here was a way of doing a piece about the SETI program and all the many thrilling things and complicated ethical things and astonishing scientific things that he'd been thinking about all of his life, about communication with a superior intelligence. And the idea of hooking that up and doing it like it had been done by people who didn't bother doing the research, well, there's just no reason for Carl to do that.
He didn't need to. Right.
He didn't need to. For me, I mean, obviously I was honoring Carl, but also I was so enamored of science and had been since I was a philosophy of science student at Columbia in graduate school, and realized that philosophy of science was just science. That I realized that the real thing was fundamentally more interesting than anything a screenwriter could make up. And if you were patient enough to do the real thing and worked with a screenwriter who was patient enough to learn the real thing, then you could portray on the screen things that were far more astonishing and awesome than anything a special effects person could make up, anything a production designer could make up, or anything a screenwriter could make up.
And blow people's minds more than fiction.
Much more than fiction. The real thing, and it's the first time in our in humanity that we have some answers to the questions we've been asking as a species for 5,000 years. So if we can help en passant, as we're telling exciting stories, show the real thing, then we have a twofer going. We have an exciting story that manages to show what the universe looks like, that manages to portray the way things really are, that manages to extrapolate the most interesting science questions science is raising and illuminate questions science has now figured out or partially figured out in ways that are mind-boggling and exciting and have never been shown in movies before.
Is it true that while you were filming Contact that Carl would lecture and teach the cast and crew about astronomy?
Well, they just wouldn't let him not because, you know, people would come over to Carl and ask him questions and he would always answer. That's just the way he was as a person. All the cast wanted to know more about their characters. Obviously, Bill Finnegan, who played the astronomer, wanted to know everything about radio astronomy, and Carl knew everything about radio astronomy and taught him. Jodie wanted to know. Jodie Foster, and she has told us that it's her favorite part she ever played. Wanted to know everything about astrobiology and what she might see out there. She wanted to know everything about wormholes, which is another great story. I'll tell you later.
We'll talk about wormholes. And then Carl Sagan died while this film was being made. Is that right? Or before it came out?
Right after.
Yeah.
Right after. He was able to see the movie come out.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yes.
In your memoir or primer for getting anything done in Hollywood called Hello, He Lied, you infuse your writing with scientific analogies. So, for example, this is from you. The universe was made in bursts of high energy interrupted by long spells of nothingness. This is my life. The cosmologists call this punctuated equilibrium. In Hollywood, we call it hurry up and wait when nothing happens for what seems like millennia and then everything happens at once. So how did you become such a geek?
I became a geek through philosophy of science, really.
Were you a curious kid? Did you ever think about becoming a scientist?
Well, I got put in advanced science in 6th grade. And then in 9th grade, I was in advanced science. But my mother told me I was bad in math. I think if I had been put in advanced math too, I would have ended up a scientist. But I was the only person in advanced science who wasn't in calculus. So I had that kind of girl math problem that
assigned to you, sadly. Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I was they put me on that track where I was better in English, and I wasn't supposed to be so good in science. But then all of a sudden, I showed this aptitude in science that just didn't fit the bill. So I geeked out in science in 6th grade, and I geeked out in science in 9th grade. So and all the nerdy boys loved me, and I loved all the nerdy boys.
You still do.
I really still do it. But I was the only one who wasn't working a slide rule and wasn't doing calculus. And I think had I gotten a tutor that year, 6th grade, in math, I probably would have gone the other way. Right now, all my best friends are scientists. My girlfriends, besides Annie, who's a kind of a scientist, meant Kay too. And then I went into philosophy for graduate school, and I leaned towards philosophy of science. So I did philosophy of science in undergraduate, my thesis, and then I did philosophy of science in graduate school at Columbia. And then all of a sudden I realized I was doing philosophy of physics. And then I was sitting in the library and I was like, there is no philosophy of physics. There's just physics. Physics is philosophy of physics. So I started just reading physics. And once again, I couldn't do the calculations, but I could read all of the abstracts, and I understood them. So I had this really theoretical mind. I could truly understand theoretical physics. I just couldn't do the calculations. So that's what I was doing in the philosophy class. We were the people that understood the material but didn't do the calculations. So that's sort of when I became a geek. And then I got lucky enough to become an editor at the New York Times, where you can really be a monkey. And so I started following science, and around that time I met Carl and Tim Ferriss, They both did articles for me in the Times. And you're just so lucky when you work for a paper like that, because you can just chase the most interesting subjects in the world.
But
and
you know,
get great writers.
You have probably the most improbable path to Hollywood of anyone I've ever heard of. I mean, it is just not, most people just dream of making movies, you know? And you were reading theoretical physics and became a producer.
Yeah, it's odd, but I was
satisfying?
Also really satisfying.
Is it most satisfying for you to be a movie producer who's producing movies about science?
Yes. I think now that I'm doing movies that I really love, I mean, it's interesting because it's a very crazy time in the movie business where you can't do small movies very easily. But the movies I love are big because they take place on a huge canvas.
I'll say.
And so that works for me. And television has become so interesting that I can do TV shows about women who interest me a great deal. The whole gender, and also character pieces on television. So it's just a very prolific moment in the medium, in media, because there's sort of each idea has its own venue, its own kind of venue. I think the only thing I'm not doing well is comedy. And I don't know if it's because the world's not very funny right now, or I haven't figured out how to do it quite yet, you know, in this new world.
I don't think there's a bigger canvas for telling a story than the one you used for Interstellar, which of course is the entire galaxy, is the universe. Interstellar spent a decade in development. Now, is that normal, or did Interstellar have its own kind of special place in hell?
Yes, it had its own special place in development hell, not unlike Contacts in a way, because it's about, you know, whose hand it was in at a given time. It was always, although Interstellar was a little bit different. Kip Thorne, who I met through Carl, because Carl was looking for a way for Ellie to get to the center of the galaxy and back very quickly in 6.5 minutes, as I remember. He had originally written in the book that she got there through a black hole, and a mistake J.J. Abrams often makes in Star Trek. And he knew there was something wrong with it, so he sent the manuscript to Kip Thorne. There he is, with Chris Nolan. And so Kip went through the manuscript, and he did calculations, and he realized the only way for Ellie to get back and forth from the center of the galaxy is if she had gone through a wormhole. And he did extensive calculations to see if a wormhole were possible. And he came to the conclusion, and it's really, really interesting science. He came to the conclusion that a wormhole were possible under certain circumstances. That is, wormholes exist in particle bubbles and foam of particles. They can be created in foam, but that's too small to travel through, obviously, in quantum physics. Wormholes can be created in a much larger setting, but they can't be held open, right? They collapse immediately upon being formed. So, but it's possible for certain what he calls exotic material. That means we can't make it, but it's theoretically possible to be made. A wormhole could be held open by this exotic material that we don't know how to make, but a superior intelligence would have to make it because we now don't know how to make this material. That's what material science is for. But some smarter intelligence would have to be able to come up with this exotic material. So therefore...
Was Kip Thorne the first kind of person to articulate this?
Yes.
Okay.
And therefore...
And he was doing this kind of theoretical science in service of a film.
Bingo.
It's amazing.
Amazing. And wormhole science was born. And lots of science came out of that. And I'm so proud of that. I can't tell you. It's how a movie sparked research.
I mean...
I'm so proud of that. It's amazing.
Yeah, if there were nothing else, right? If I don't know, if we took Sleepless in Seattle off your resume or what, like.
That's the most exciting thing ever, and
art furthering science.
That's exactly right. And it also posits, the wormhole work he did, various circumstances in which backward time travel might be possible. And backward time travel is thought to be impossible, but wormholes show a way, a little too technical for me to explain now, in which if certain circumstances occur, backward time travel is possible, which will make all the people on Fringe very happy. Because they always use it, and it's now thought to be impossible in terms of relativity. Okay, so according to relativity, it's impossible, but if certain things obtain inside a wormhole, it could be possible. It's what we call extrapolatable.
Extrapolatable. I also like that. I've just learned, what is it, exotic material? Is that right?
Isn't that a great
one?
Yeah,
it sounds very, very, very dirty.
So,
but wait, just so I understand, so I remember Interstellar correctly, they're traveling through a wormhole, not a black hole.
Right.
Okay.
You can't travel through a black hole. So that conversation that Scotty and Kirk had in the middle of a black hole in Star Trek, they're dead. They're like a million trillion
sliced
Lynda
up
pieces.
So not everybody knows that. So when you were watching Star Trek, were you
with Kip.
You went to go see Star Trek with Kip Thorne?
We were flipping out.
Were you in a theater?
Yes.
Were you quietly flipping out? Were you two yelling at the screen?
Yes. Well, he was quieter than I was.
What did you yell?
I was like, Kip, they're having a conversation in the middle of a black hole. He was like, it's really unbelievable.
And all these people were like, well, y'all shut up, and they're throwing popcorn at you. You met Kip Thorne on a blind date?
I did. Carl set us up on a blind date.
That is the cutest meet ever.
Yeah, and we were boyfriend and girlfriend for quite a while.
Well, what happened? You both have brilliant minds. You have a philosophy background. He's a scientist.
It was the greatest. He asked me to marry him, but he had a maroon tuxedo on, which I remember as baby blue, but he tells me was maroon.
Wait, when he asked you to marry him, that's what he was wearing?
No, at the blind date.
Oh, okay.
And so I'm so shallow.
You could never get over it?
I couldn't get over it. But it's probably great because we've remained partners and best friends ever since. And so we began Interstellar. So I went to him during a particularly during one of those wait, when nothing's happening periods in my career.
Yeah.
And Kip and I had dinner, which we often do. And I said, I'm so bored. I just can't find one fun movie. Just everything I'm reading is terrible. And it was during this period when after the DVD had collapsed and nobody was making anything, certainly never a romantic comedy again. And I said, Kip, tell me, he was working on gravitational waves on LIGO, which he then discovered this year in one of the biggest discoveries of the century.
Chirp heard round the world.
Exactly. Yep. And I said, if you ever found something on LIGO, what would be the most astonishing discovery that could possibly be made on it? That's how Interstellar began. So we started working on a treatment.
Did you say he or we?
We, together, started working on a movie idea then. We worked on it for about a week, and then I had lunch with an agent at CAA.
I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you. That work on a week with Kip Thorne, was that so satisfying?
We love working together. We have so much fun.
But also you're not sitting around with a whiteboard figuring out a romantic comedy. You're working on the biggest questions of the universe.
Yes. That's why I love my partnership with Kip.
All right, so you had lunch with the CAA.
And so did Chris Nolan love his partnership with Kip. His mind is you can see what he did with Carl on finding the wormhole. His mind is so fertile, and if you give him a puzzle, he comes up with an answer that's 1,000,000 times better than your question. So we ended up puzzling out this trip through the cosmos, through a wormhole. And we wrote a treatment. Thank you for that picture.
Isn't that beautiful?
Beautiful. And that's our wormhole that big discoveries were made on or important discoveries were made on for Interstellar. And so about the end of that week, I was having a pre-scheduled lunch with a wonderful agent, Todd Feldman at CAA. And he said, "What are you working on?" And I said, "Kip Thorne and I are doing a grounded science piece on a trip through a wormhole and what it would be like and what they discover." And he said, "Finish it. I'm going to give it to Steven." And he meant Steven Spielberg.
Right.
I said, "Well, we just started." He said, "Finish it. I want it by the end of the week." So I called Kip and I said, "We have to finish this thing." Anyway, long story short, we finished it. We gave it to Steven, and over the weekend, Steven committed to it. So then we went to work with Steven for 5 years. Wow. On working on the script. He had us go find a writer. He turned down my first 4 choices and selected the right writer, Jonah Nolan, who, as you may guess...
Nolan, brother of Christopher Nolan. Okay.
Exactly. So we worked on the script. We developed a great script. And then, in the middle of great drama, Steven and Paramount fell out. They couldn't make Steven's deal.
Paramount was wearing a maroon tux. It was bad. It was bad all over.
Brilliant. Paramount was wearing a maroon tux. Exactly right. And Steven left the movie. And Lynda fell to the floor. Yeah.
Not for the first time in your career, though.
Not for the first time in my career, as you have read.
This show was so stellar that we went over our time limit. So tune in next week to see the second half of this conversation on Science Goes to the Movies.